My guest today is Donald Jeffries. He's an author and researcher. He has been involved in research against the JFK issues since the 1970s. He worked with pioneer researcher and conspiracy theorist Mark Elaine. He published his first novel in 2007, The Unreals. Last year, he published his first nonfiction book, Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups in American politics. Donald's blog is Keeping It Unreal. That's at donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. Donald, how are you doing today?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. I guess the main topic today is your book, Hidden History, and of course, that really covers a whole lot of topics. But you start off with the JFK assassination. You call it the mother of all conspiracies. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is the chapter. I guess, is that what got you involved in conspiracy and sort of revisionist history research?
Yeah, definitely, and it's still kind of my main topic, my go-to topic, if you would. Yeah, I probably started really reading the critical works on it as a teenager in the mid-1970s. And then, as you noted, I joined Mark Lane's group, the Citizens Committee of Inquiry, as a teenage volunteer and had one memorable meeting with him at his townhouse, which I describe in the book. We lobbied Congress to try to get the assassination investigation reopened. And, of course, we were all terribly disillusioned with the House Select Committee on Assassinations and the way they kind of sold out. I continue to be interested. I read all the early works on the subject. In recent years, I don't quite read as much on it because it's a lot of it's old hat to me. But if something comes out that I'm really interested in, then I will still read it. And I keep very active on the JFK forums and so forth, and I write about it. Write about that and other things on my blog. And obviously, Hidden History has the biggest part of Hidden History is about the Kennedy assassination, and also the way it overlapped into other things.
Mm-hmm. Now, you get into I guess the main problem with the Kennedy assassination would be the one character, Lee Harvey Oswald, in regards to the official story. One only has to look at his story and realize that the Warren report is junk.
Right.
And so, from all available evidence, it indicates that Oswald was some sort of mid-level intelligence asset, either working for the Justice Department or CIA or maybe multiple agencies. It's a convoluted story. But he definitely wasn't the lone nut because, No,
definitely not. I mean, I think, I tend to agree with Jim Garrison. I believe he was the first one to theorize that Oswald was some kind of intelligence asset that at the time of the assassination had been assigned to infiltrate what he was told was a brewing plot to kill Kennedy. Mm-hmm. So I believe he thought he was trying to stop it. And, we don't know exactly what intelligence agency, whether it was CIA, Office of Naval Intelligence, FBI, but he was connected to somebody. As Senator Richard Schweiker said, he had the fingerprints of intelligence all over him. Mm-hmm. And he certainly wasn't, this minimum wage loser that was drawn, to Marxism and somehow managed to be, an outspoken communist in the Marine Corps at the height of the Cold War, without getting in any trouble. So his story is incredible, and but it's whoever killed Kennedy. That's why people ask me, who killed JFK, and it's pretty obvious who covered it up. To name the actual shooters at this point would be probably impossible, but I think we can definitely say that it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, whoever it was.
I think it was Richard Nixon when he was.
Well, it's
no, I'm sorry, I'm not saying not Richard Nixon. I'm saying I think if Richard Nixon, you said, was asked that question, he reported to have said Dallas killed John F. Kennedy.
Yeah. Nixon said a lot of things, didn't he?
I think then he was referring to sort of the milieu down there.
Yeah.
Like Clint Murchison and the Texas, the oil barons and the interests.
Well, it was an ugly area. They treated Adlai Stevenson very badly right before that, and it was, certainly he wasn't. And then they had the "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy" posters to Dallas when he arrived, and so. But I tend to. I think what a lot of people have done, they tried to marginalize it and make it seem as if it was a bunch of racist oilmen or something, or renegade CIA agents that did it. I think this was a much bigger conspiracy, and if you read my book, you'll see I got in trouble on the forums quite a bit because I don't look at the JFK assassination in a vacuum, and that's why I presented the book the way I did. Is that these things are connected, whether they're directly connected or not. You can see the same kinds of things, that are associated with every one of these events: the withholding of evidence, the unnatural deaths of witnesses, the bogus claims of national security. I mean, why would anything in the JFK assassination be classified as national security if a lone nut minimum wage loser killed him? I mean, what would be national security related about that? But that's what we find everywhere, whether it's the JFK assassination, 9/11, Oklahoma City, anything. We find it over and over again, and that's why I draw connections to these, and I think it is, as I define it, it's organized corruption, which I think is the same thing as a conspiracy. And I think we have people, utterly corrupt people that lead us, and this is their way of doing business. It's standard operating procedure for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have a particular interpretation of the Kennedy phenomenon, which I think is rather interesting because what the Kennedys represented. There's a quote I ran across in Paul Johnson's A History of the American People. Mm-hmm. And if you bear with me, I'll read it to you. And he's talking about Camelot and the rise, the political ascendancy of the Kennedys and what it represented. And I'll start here, see what you think. I think it kind of captures the feeling that people had towards the Kennedys. It may have factored, one of the factors into his murder and subsequent murders in the family. As Tip O'Neill put it, looking back on his congressional campaign and on his later campaigns for the Senate and then for the presidency, he's talking about John F. Kennedy, I have to say that Jack was only nominally a Democrat. He was a Kennedy, which was more than a family affiliation. It quickly developed into an entire political party with its own people, its own approach, and its own strategies. The man who got it right at the time was the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. He grasped the important point that electing a Kennedy was not so much as giving office to an individual as handing over power to a family business, a clan, an almost milieu, with a set of attitudes about how office was to be acquired and used, which at no point coincided with the American ethic. I would say the WASP ethic. That's the Catholic in me talking there. Having paid his first visit after Kennedy's election as president, Macmillan, who was asked on his return what it was like in Kennedy's Washington, says, "Oh," said he, "it's rather like watching the Borgia brothers take over a respectable North Italian city." And again, what the Kennedys represent, I mean, often the Kennedys referred to as the Irish mob coming into town by the WASPs. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's many ways you can look at the Kennedy phenomenon. There are people who look at it more idealistically, look at more realistically as a sort of a competing power block. And this is the Kennedy clan. How their approach to politics was a little different. I mean, Joe Kennedy, was acquired his wealth in the 20s and 30s, and he transferred that wealth into political power. And I guess Kennedy, with the death of his brother Joe in World War II, John Kennedy was the heir to that, and his coming to power. What did the Kennedys represent? Why were they? You read that quote, and what do you think of that quote? Does that kind of capture the feeling that maybe the elite had towards the Kennedy clan?
Yeah, I think it's very, illuminating. And if you read my book, you see I have lots of quotes in there about the Kennedys. Mm-hmm. The Kennedys were treated differently because they're nominally considered liberals. They're liberal Democrats, and maybe the public perceives them that way, but the elite never did. When Joseph Kennedy had, Franklin Roosevelt despised him, Winston Churchill did, Harry Truman hated him. In fact, they claimed he was almost a fight between him and Harry Truman in the White House. And, they despised Joseph Kennedy. They perceived him as being an appeaser of the Nazis. And so they did not like his sons at all. And, the first Kennedy death, as you pointed out, was Joseph Kennedy Jr., who's the real star of the family. And, really better looking than Jack Kennedy, if you can believe that, and more charismatic and a natural politician. He would have, I have no doubt he would have been president of the United States. And probably had more of a feel for it than John F. Kennedy, who really didn't come to really become a political animal until later. He felt an obligation, as you said, as the heir to the throne, and he wanted to please his father. But if you look at all those quotes I have about it, you'll see that there's a difference between the Kennedys and, say, Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman or even LBJ. I mean, there's a movie coming out now directed by Rob Reiner, the old meathead from All in the Family, who is your quintessential liberal, supposedly, just typical Hollywood leftist, and it's basically a glowing tribute to LBJ. And the man who, wires in Vietnam and who the counterculture supposedly hated, but they're coming around now to, and you will see his historical reputation will grow because he was an establishment liberal, just as an establishment conservative will be, satisfactory to the powers that be as well. But a guy like Kennedy was different, and they understand it. And that's why, you still see, for instance, right now I'm working on Hidden History 2, which is kind of prequel, pre-1963 crimes and cover-ups. But if you look at Franklin Roosevelt's record, he had tons of scandals. He was a real womanizer, but you never hear that said about him. That's never stressed when discussing him. In Kennedy's, JFK's case, that's all that's stressed. They talk about the womanizing first, and all the Kennedys up to John F. Kennedy Jr., where, I have a lot about his death in the book. We have this portrait of them as reckless, of being, so excessively Kennedy-like, this crazy behavior that causes them to, drop like flies unnaturally. They're always dying unnaturally. I mean, I tabulate the deaths in the book there. It's incredible. I mean, the odds are, if you think the Kennedy assassination witnesses died, disproportionately, you could certainly say the same thing about the Kennedy family members and those closest to them. So this is the frightening aspect of the research, is to realize that, some of these things can't, or most of these things can't be coincidental, but certainly the Kennedys are viewed negatively by the left, probably as much as or more than they're viewed by the right. So, and I think that makes them different. And considering how they were killed and the efforts that are still going in to covering up the circumstances behind JFK's death, RFK's death, and John F. Kennedy Jr.'s death, I think you can be safely assumed that they were killed by very powerful forces.
And would you call maybe it was sort of the conflict or fear that maybe the WASP elite had toward the growing Catholic power in the mid-20th century?
Well, I'm sure there was some of that, and a lot of this probably you try to figure out how these powerful forces interconnect. But certainly there are tons of Freemasons that have been in power in powerful positions for a long time, and they're certainly strongly opposed to Catholics. Mm-hmm. So you could look at it that way. And Carl Oglesby wrote a book, The Yankee and Cowboy War, years ago, back in the 70s, which is interesting. And I think that was his theory, was that the Kennedys were a kind of an opposing power, but I just tend to think of it that whether you're an honest person from the left, an honest person from the right, for instance, in today's world, you can see like when Dennis Kucinich was one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination, he was never going to get any attention because he was different from all the others. He was an honest leftist, and he was going to do something, a Huey Long type action where he's actually going to try to help people. Huey Long's my political hero, and that's why he still gets such awful press. But, a guy like Franklin Roosevelt, who he despised and actually accused of plotting to assassinate him, gets great press. And it's the same thing with like a Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan's an honest writer today because he talks about trade. He talks about losing jobs. And I think that's why Donald Trump has such appeal, is because he's mentioned jobs and bringing jobs back to America. And no, you don't see anybody on the left or right do that. Bernie Sanders is never, he may give, a little bit of attention to that, but in the next step, he wants to raise the payroll tax on, which is only taxes the first $119,000 of people. So who's going to be paying that tax. He's not an enemy of the rich. So yeah, I think the Kennedys were different.
And you can see it in some of the policy decisions, because although we're told to see Kennedy, John Kennedy, as a reckless womanizer and drug addict and sickly, he stood up to the military brass. The Cuban Missile Crisis, and there's a sense in there where I think he was very much a cultural Catholic in his upbringing. He realized he was surrounded by a bunch of psychopaths, and I think he had the expression, "You stare into the abyss, and the abyss stares back at you."
Yeah,
and he kind of realized what he was confronted with. Same with his brother, although a very flawed man, very ambitious, and you could say exercises power in questionable ways in many instances, but nevertheless. From my own research with the Kennedys, and I come from a conservative Republican background. I came of age during the Reagan era, and that was sort of how that's what I identified with. So I had no real admiration for Kennedy politics, but as I've done research, I'm starting to realize the significance of the Kennedys and why they were targeted. and why they may still be targeted by the ruling elite, which is a very small group of people that really run things. Bobby Kennedy, someone was saying earlier, would have become the family priest.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's the thing. He's never been. They can't associate too many, womanizing other than the Marilyn Monroe stuff. But they really can't associate much of that with him. And he, as you said, he was ruthless, but he was a zealot, and in many ways. And he first he had the crusade, against the mafia, which no other person of his stature ever had, or has had since. And then he was, very much a zealot about helping the poor, and not just the black poor. The Kennedys, people forget that the Kennedys were the first people ever to go into Appalachia. Probably is the worst state of poverty, certainly in this country, if not the world. And, no one had ever paid attention to those people before. They don't have a voting bloc. They don't have any organizations devoted to them. So I think that's what made them appeal to me, is that they, and I think we run into that today when we try to marginalize these issues. Like, instead of just, decrying poverty, we turn it into a racial issue. So it's only black poverty that matters. And same thing with, police officers. Well, they're out of control against everyone, but we're only going to be concerned in selected cases when it's a white officer and a black, victim. And, so that's what happens, is when you marginalize it, you make it into a predictable racial issue, then that people can, divide up into their usual left-right game, what Alex Jones calls the phony left-right paradigm. And I think it is. And I think the Kennedys are outside of that. And that's why you see a guy like Bobby Kennedy Jr. today is, he would have a bright political career if we had an honest civilization, but we don't, because he is, in fact, he has my book. Skyhorse sent him a copy of my book. I'm still hoping somehow to hear from him, but, I think he's very much aware of what happened to all his relatives, and he knows the dangers involved. But he has strayed off the reservation here and talked about the links between vaccines and autism, and also talked about voter fraud, and that marginalizes him. He'll never be. They won't even allow any kind of dissent on any of those issues, and they have to stay. They can't talk about the Federal Reserve. They can't talk too much about the fact that we're involved in war. I heard recently that Bernie Sanders came out and was speaking approvingly of drones. I mean, what kind of leftist is so now all the Democrats are, I think they've taken up the cry, well, if we'd had drones in Iraq, your boys wouldn't have died. I mean, this is insanity. It's a war party. And that's why when you mentioned JFK in the military, he was the only president that I've studied and researched them all. And, really, especially in the modern era, when you can, almost go back to 1898 when we first really went imperialistic with the Spanish-American War, and McKinley reluctantly was forced into that, and it kind of paved the way for real jingoist in Teddy Roosevelt, really the second imperialist president behind Lincoln. But ever since then, whenever there's been a call for war, when there's, been a situation brewing somewhere where there's, there's a call for America to become involved, the president always accedes, sometimes asks the Congress for a declaration of war, sometimes not. But in Kennedy's case, he resisted it over and over again. And, I think he signed his death warrant when he put out National Security Action Memorandum 263, which delineated his plans to withdraw from Vietnam. Yeah. And people, will still claim somehow that wasn't significant. And what's really important to remember is National Security Action Memorandum 273, written by McGeorge Bundy. So if you want to know the name of the conspirator that had foreknowledge, I think we can safely say that McGeorge Bundy did, was written by him, and it completely contradicted the policy of the very recent Action Memorandum 263. And it would have never been signed by Kennedy. It was written the day of the assassination. There's no way he would have signed it. So a man like Bundy would not have written that unless he knew Kennedy wasn't going to be alive to sign it. So I think that's one of the clearest cases we have that there was high-level government foreknowledge of the assassination. Of
course, reversing policy in Vietnam, pulling troops out and de-escalating and stopping an escalation was upsetting a lot of plans. I think Fletcher Prouty talks about the $1 billion phone call with Boston National Bank and the helicopter, Bell helicopter. And there's just a lot of money at stake. There's the dredging of harbors, all the armaments that were expended in Vietnam, all the money, the big contracts, and that's the military industrial complex that worked there. There was the interest of the Pentagon and the Army wanting their ground war because they had been marginalized by the Air Force in the 1950s. And then also you have the long-standing policy in Asia with the Skull and Bones, the CIA, and the heroin trafficking. Yeah. Which was, you could argue, was the source of the problem, whereas in the 40s and 50s you have the OSS and CIA kind of nudging the French out. Mm-hmm. And the 54, and that's what the Vietnam conflict was all about. And of course, then again, the war itself was a great way to import heroin from Southeast Asia into the United States in the bodies of American troops. Sure. And creating a very lucrative market here in the United States for such things. And some have speculated that was a broad-based plan to kind of opiate the masses and kind of change the culture. That's a whole other topic. Right. But American involvement in drug trafficking, U.S. government involvement in drug trafficking was long-standing because as far back as World War II, the U.S. government had gotten into the business with Lucky Luciano. Right. Right. And that set up the whole French connection angle there. Exactly. So there's a whole lot of intrigue there. Sure. But needless to say, the Kennedy brothers, particularly after the father had his stroke, 'cause the father was kind of the deal maker, So he kind of, I think maybe the father kind of understood the powers that be and knew that you couldn't go too far. And as soon as Joe Kennedy had his stroke, the two sons, you could argue were a little more idealistic, maybe arguably naive, maybe. Yes. Ruffled a lot of feathers, and then that's when there wasn't one thing. It wasn't just National Security Memorandum 263. It was them taking on the mafia. Yeah. It was them kind of saying no to the military-industrial complex, which is why General what's his name, with the cigar. Yeah, LeMay is seen at the autopsy, kind of lording over the autopsy. Exactly. Yeah, right? Yeah. So it's fascinating. But from the Kennedy assassination, we get the 1960s, right? Mm-hmm. And with the Kennedy assassination, him being assassinated in public like that, in living color for all to see, some people have said that was part of a ritual to kind of introduce the era into the turmoil of the 60s. It's sort of an esoteric and occultic interpretation of it. Michael Hoffman does that in his book, in Secret Societies. Right. How it's introduction into the turmoil of the 60s. Of course, you're familiar with Dave McGowan's research. Oh, yeah. So we understand he died on November 22nd. I know. Yeah. I mean, that's eerie. Yes. Yeah, I wrote a tribute to him on my blog. If people go there, they can see after he died. Yeah, he was. It was very frightening to consider that because he was very much like me, a few years younger than me. But he wrote about things that are out there, and maybe more than I do, because he wrote a lot about he's straight into the crisis actors area. He had some great stuff about the Boston bombing and his Lincoln assassination stuff, which he never got to complete. Yes, it's fascinating, right? Creepy and fascinating because they're doing this. They were pulling this back in the 1860s. Yeah. He almost had me thinking the Lincoln assassination didn't happen. It's like I said, wow, but he's convincing. Yeah, but he would take on these topics. I had the pleasure of interviewing him back in April. Okay. Just before his diagnosis. Yeah, boy. And we got into some of the stuff, the serial killers, and if you get into Operation Phoenix in South Vietnam and psychological warfare and who's conducting psychological warfare, it's not too far-fetched. But he took these wild topics but applied sort of a Farmer Brown's logic to it, which made it very difficult to dismiss him if you read his work. Yeah, he was a great guy, and yes, I'm very familiar with that. And you're right, the 60s, I think psychologically, the Kennedy assassination, because I know I was 7 years old when it happened. As a little kid, it had a huge impact on me. We were a Catholic family, and your name's Kelly. I'm imagining you're a Catholic family too. So, our family was proud of Kennedy being the first Catholic president, and they were crushed. And I remember, there wasn't a relative around that believed the official story. I mean, they weren't really conspiracy theorists, and they all kind of turned their animosity towards LBJ because he was a natural. You talk about a WASP, he was a walking, talking WASP, that just sounded so. And the difference from going to that cultured, refined, good-looking JFK to this big, dopey-looking guy that could barely, articulate a sentence in LBJ, and someone that really looked like he was literally reading notes outside of Air Force One when they came back to Washington to try to express his grief. I mean, he was so utterly unconvincing and looking upset.
that, I think that's what first, and that's really what first gave feud to the, gave rise to the feud between LBJ and RFK, was the fact that his behavior after the assassination was just, and his entourage, they couldn't contain their glee, and they tried to, but they just weren't very good actors, and so he, at the very least, but of course I don't believe he was the mastermind behind it, but I have no doubt that he had knowledge that it was going to happen before.
Yeah, well, yeah. In order to pull it off, you'd have to have control of the authorities, J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ, who were good friends, by the way.
Right.
And both very compromised, by Meyer Lansky in regards to, if reports are accurate, regards to J. Edgar Hoover. And blackmail is a big business. That's how politics is really controlled, in the bribery and blackmail and murder.
Right, exactly.
It's the Game of Thrones. But one other thing is of course, he takes the oath on Air Force One. He doesn't have to. And there's that telling photograph with, was it Senator Thomas?
Yeah. Albert Thomas is winking. Yeah. They caught him in a wink, and and you see Lady Bird Johnson in that photo. Lady Bird just looks goofy. I mean, she's got a smile on her face that's so inappropriate. Yeah. Nobody's ever talked about that. I mean, the entire, Jack Valenti's there, went on to run the movie business. It's just incredible, that it was captured, in just a couple photographs. And the fact that this act of sadism where he brings, he forces Jackie Kennedy to stand next to him, which was totally unnecessary, and witness this while you can still see the blood on her dress. And it was symbolically, like I said, it was a shock to America. And, like you said, as if it was the first act of a play or something, but it really, had a theatrical aspect to it, the unbelievably excessive funeral, based on Lincoln's funeral. And after Lincoln died, they had the same kind of thing where they had this huge cross-country tour that lasted for like a month or something, and Kennedy was on a smaller scale. That it really had an impact on the country. The people at the time, I think they felt afterwards that things would never be the same, and I think you can really trace our downward spiral directly if there was a graph from November 22nd, 1963, because the fact they never adequately explained, especially after Oswald was shot on TV and with all the police officers supposedly protecting him. That as a 7-year-old kid, I knew something wasn't right about that.
Yeah, 2 days later, right?
Yeah, exactly. And everybody understood that he was being shot to shut him up.
But he said, he supposedly didn't get attention, but he says, I'm a patsy.
Yeah, I'm a patsy. Exactly. And he kept, in my book, one of the things that I don't think people talk about enough, the critics don't, is that if there's one thing Oswald was concentrating on in all his, few public utterances that we have, we don't really know what he was saying behind closed doors because all of those interrogation sessions went unrecorded. So people have said, what exactly were they planning to use against him? They had no documentation for anything he'd said. So this was not standard operating procedure for anything in those days, certainly not of a person accused of murdering the President of the United States. But in all his public utterances in the hallways and forth and at his midnight press conference, he was asking for a lawyer. He kept saying, I want legal representation. These people denied me legal representation. Well, in my book, I point out that you had the Dallas Bar Association and the local chapter of the ACLU had different people come and visit him. They testified that Oswald told them he wasn't interested in having a lawyer. And so, how big does this conspiracy go? Because that's all he was saying that we heard. So that tells you how huge these things are because, clearly those people were lying. Because why would Oswald have been saying that in public at behind closed doors, saying, it's no big deal. I don't need a lawyer. And that's all he was saying. I do request someone to come forward and give me legal representation. That's what he was stressing. So I think that's the kind of things that make you, sit there and scratch your head. You can say, wow, how big, how many people, because that's what I run into a lot of times. How many people would have had to been involved in this conspiracy? Well, it's like, I'm just telling you what's there. I'm showing you that doesn't make any sense. So if you want to accuse those guys that testified before the Warren Commission of lying, well, I would at least grill them if they were alive and say, why did you say that? How do you just juxtapose that against, these public pronouncements of Oswald begging and pleading for an attorney? Mm-hmm. So, that's just one little aspect I think that people haven't focused on enough.
And how it was pulled off, the mechanics behind it, there was Operation Mongoose.
Right.
And so it would have been a relatively very simple procedure to sort of reverse engineer it and target the president as opposed to targeting Castro.
Right. Well, I think, and that's another thing that people, I differ from a lot of people where I think, there's so many footprints and obvious little breadcrumbs left for people, with Cuban names and directions. But I think, if we look at it, I don't think Cuba had anything to do with the assassination. And I don't think it was a motive at all, because look at what happened afterwards. If the people that wanted to kill him did so because they were resenting the fact that he was trying to establish more normal relations with Cuba, they had to have been really upset with what happened afterwards, because Cuba basically died as an American political issue with the Kennedy assassination. LBJ never attempted and if he was more friendly to their efforts to overthrow Castro, they never tried again, at least that we know of. And, Cuba was not a campaign issue. I mean, Barry Goldwater didn't talk about it in 1964. In 1968, Nixon coming into office, he wasn't saying, we need to get rid of Castro. None of this went on. People stopped talking about Castro after the assassination and Cuba. And of course, he still lives today. And so it's but we still have people saying, there was, this is the plan was to kill Castro, and then, they turned it to kill Kennedy. Well, then why didn't they kill Castro? If they wanted to kill Castro that badly, like I said, they had to have been upset with LBJ's performance and Nixon's performance, because they didn't try to do anything. I mean, I believe the Kennedys tried to stop the attempts on Castro's lives, but there weren't any attempts apparently afterwards. So and same thing with people say that Kennedy was killed because of the civil rights movement. Well, everything was passed afterwards, and we've had tons of civil rights laws since then. So that couldn't have been a motive. So I think we have to look at what what he was trying to do that was altered. And I think Vietnam is obviously one big one. I think the CIA, when he was talking about smashing into 1,000 pieces, certainly their power grew, and obviously the mafia. And this, if it's true, I mean, some people, we talked about the Federal Reserve, we're talking about him attempting to issue greenbacks, much as Lincoln had before his assassination. And so I think there are indications that he may really have known a little bit about the Federal Reserve more than most politicians do, courtesy of his father. Mm-hmm. He was very astute financially, and I think his father knew exactly how corrupt the Federal Reserve was. So he was trying to do some revolutionary things, and I don't think his assassination had anything to do with civil rights or Cuba.
Well, some people have theorized that the crime scene down there was polluted with all types of figures and characters that would cause people to go off on these blind alleys. Putting Nixon down there, putting Bush down there.
Exactly.
Bush of all people. People don't realize Bush was claimed he didn't remember where he was when Kennedy was assassinated. Although at the time he was a 39-year-old candidate for the U.S. Senate from Texas.
Right.
He couldn't say where he was. Well, it turns out Bush was a CIA agent.
Right.
Most likely.
Yeah.
And of course that's why, of course, he ascended to the Director of Central Intelligence in 1976.
Exactly, yeah.
But, of course, the Bush, later on maybe I'll talk to you about the Bush crime family and their connection to all this, because they intersect with the Clintons and Contras and cocaine and, perhaps human trafficking and elite pedophilia.
They're really like competing crime families. It does seem that way, doesn't it?
But this, of course, a few years later, Robert Kennedy is running for the presidency. He's a U.S. Senator from New York. And I guess he's told people that if elected, he will reopen the investigation that is rumored to have been, which is understandable.
Yes. And
he wins the California primary, and then that night, this another lone nut, who shoots at him from the front and is able to kill him.
Right.
But the bullets that kill him are in the back of his head.
Right.
And, all accounts, he seemed to be some sort of classic mind-controlled, Manchurian Candidate type assassin. That's what the evidence suggests.
Yeah, still to this day supposedly doesn't remember anything. Yeah, and you had in that assassination, I go into depth about the girl in the polka dot dress. I mean, they had a lead to follow right away. They did everything they could not to follow that lead. Certainly, the girl in the polka dot dress, whoever she was an obvious handler in a way of Sirhan, was seen with him over and over again. and was, that's apparently all he remembers. I think at this point he says he was given a drink by the girl or something. He said something like that, and that's all he remembered. And then he remembered being wrestled, on the table by Rayford Johnson and Rosie Greer and all those people.
And do you know the story of Scott Enyart, the photographer?
Yeah, he's my friend on Facebook.
Okay, so you're familiar with his story about the photographs, how they got stolen 15 years later or something, right?
Yeah, and he was a teenager at the time, yeah. And he's and that's one of the things we find, about the RFK assassination. This was 1968, and it's very strange when these crimes occur. There's never any live footage of them, and we saw that in 1963, the Kennedy assassination. I was watching again the other day the lost JFK tapes, and I watch these things just. Even though they're all pretty much all disinformation if they're appearing on network television, but it's nice to watch the footage, and you can see how thoroughly documented his entire trip to Texas was, except for that motorcade. And I've talked to Vince Palomara, who's the expert on the Secret Service, and certainly they're one of the people. You want to point fingers at people that stood down that day. You have to look at his Secret Service detail, but he told me in an email, everything he studied that was the only time the press car had been that far back in the motorcade. I mean, every other occasion, you can see the press cars right up front where they can get a perfect view of him and they can film him, but they weren't that day. And so what we find is you have professional footage of JFK's trip up, through his arrival at Love Field, and, he gets off and shakes hands with him and Jackie shake hands with the crowd. After that, as soon as they get on, and you can see the Henry Ripko, I have the story of Henry Ripko in my book, the Secret Service agent is shrugging his, like saying, what's going on when he's called off at the last minute. You can see the film of that at the airport when they're basically telling him, no, you can't come, because he must not have been in on it or something. But from that moment on, really until after his arrival at the hospital, there was no more professional footage. And that's really a huge hole in the record there, and it just happens to be, it's kind of like the missing pages from John Wilkes Booth diary, or the 18-minute-and-a-half gap from the Nixon tapes. There's these sudden gaps that are always right at a really significant time, and in the RFK assassination, we had the same thing where there was professional footage of him giving his victory speech, and okay, perhaps it's understandable, maybe they would, but as I understand it, the networks were covering the aftermath of the primary live. So, and there was a little footage of him being followed towards the pantry, but they stopped, of course, right? And then you see the wobbling camera just like you do, in the JFK assassination. And then there's the dramatic footage of him laying on the ground with the blood coming out of his head and so forth. So, that's what I find, really eerie, is that these things are never well documented. And, as far as where people can look at it and say, wow, there's always, can be dispute about it. And then you're going to have people that can come up and say, well, that's not even, it's fake footage, because it just doesn't look right. So, but yeah, I have no doubt that Robert Kennedy, I don't believe for a second that Robert Kennedy would have ever been assassinated if John F. Kennedy hadn't been.
Yeah. Yeah, you had to kill both, especially as he got so close to the presidency.
Yes, absolutely.
There's that. And of course, the reason why I mentioned Scott Enyart, because you talked about the footage. He was taking just photo after photo.
Yes.
Right? Boom, click, 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 So, and the LAPD seized his camera and film, didn't bother to question Eugene Thane Caesar, who was armed and behind Senator Kennedy.
Right.
Or check his gun for that matter. He was a Lockheed contractor, I think.
It was Ace Security guy. Yeah, but I think it was through them. Yeah.
Well, how those relationships work. So
right.
Then years later he sues to get the film. And they delay. We don't have it. We lost it. Finally, they lose the case because this film's worth something, and it's his property, and the case is closed. And the day that they're scheduled to turn it over, the courier gets robbed.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't
right?
it?
And not only that, someone called the courier, right? If I have this right, someone called and asked for the description of the car and the route the courier is taking. So there you go.
Yeah, and that's so we in the RFK case we don't even have that. That's apparently the only amateur footage that was taken, and we don't even have that. So it's very difficult because and a lot of these. The reason these things, and you can see these events that continue to happen, is it because as Alex Jones and other people say, that you're either awake or you're asleep, and there's so many people, still the overwhelming majority of people are asleep, and it just doesn't matter. Like you're talking about that footage of Scott Enyart or anything, magic bullets, magic passports appearing. No matter how obvious it appears, no matter how much it cries out for clandestine conspiratorial behavior, people they've been conditioned not to go there. They don't want to fathom the extent of the corruption, I think, because that's what people tell me. Oh, you think everything's a conspiracy. Well, yeah, because the people running things are conspirators. This is what they do. Mm-hmm. They don't know any other way to act. I mean, they want something. This is what they do. And, I don't think it's, ridiculous to sit there and say, I question everything. People were talking about this, San Bernardino shooting, and it's like, if something is reported widely through the mainstream media, I just assume it's fake at this point. Assume it's not true.
Yeah.
Because if they're covering it, I really don't even want to pay attention to it. But if you go online, you can see these kids that are living in their parents' basements, and who are much better journalists than anybody you're going to find on ABC or NBC or CBS or CNN or Fox News. They're doing real investigative work. I mean, they're asking the questions that real journalists should, but real journalists have been conditioned. And, whether it was at the time of the Kennedy assassination, whether it was Tom Wicker and a young Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite and the people then, or the people now, the Anderson Coopers, the former CIA intern during his college days and son of Gloria Vanderbilt. He's going to be a real independent journalist. And he seems to be, if you notice that in all these things, he's like the go-to guy. Like, he interviews everybody associated with these shooting events. Like nobody else gets an interview but Anderson Cooper at this point. And it's just, when I see him, I thought, oh, come on. Needless to say, Anderson Cooper is not going to tell the truth about the Kennedy assassination or any of these other events now at this point either.
Well, this some type of cover-up or some type of conspiracy would require the complicity of what we call the free press. Because that's how you control information, that's how you control the narrative. I think it was Fletcher Prouty who tells a story. He was in New Zealand.
Yes, yeah.
And there is a newspaper there, had been printed either just before or just at the time of the assassination, on the side of the world, with detailed information on Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
So they were fed that information prior to the assassination. It was pre-planned, which means they're complicit. You get into the strange death of John F. Kennedy Jr., and if you look into the details, that is very strange.
Yeah.
You want to go into that a little bit?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's what I would. Any interested readers, I mean, really that my book is the first book that have an extensive investigation into John F. Kennedy Jr.'s death. I don't think there's any doubt that he was going to enter politics. I emailed Wayne Madsen, who's an investigative reporter, and he told me that he was set to have an interview with John F. Kennedy Jr. the week after he died. And he was going to be interviewed about a position at George Magazine, and what Kennedy wanted him to do was to specifically investigate the death of his father. I talked to a couple of old friends of his, and they assured me behind the scenes that he was obsessed with the assassination of his dad. And he was on a quest to find out who really killed him. Unlike the other Kennedys who don't seem to want to mention it, behind the scenes, this was his, quest. I mean, he went to a White House dinner not that long before he died, and his guest he brought was Larry Flynt. You remember Larry Flynt, the publisher of Hustler magazine, who was shot himself and paralyzed after offering $1 million reward to find out who really killed President Kennedy.
That was a lone nut, wasn't it?
Well, I believe they're always lone nuts. They never run out of those unlimited supply.
And you have to remember, get back to the media. At that time, the only magazines that were getting into this type of stuff were were the girly mags.
Oh, Penthouse had tons of articles. Yeah.
So you have to put it in its context. This was pre-internet.
Yeah.
These are the only investigation magazines. You'd be looking at the pictures and you come across this article.
Yeah.
And that's how it was back in the 70s.
Yeah, that was a reality. But for JFK Jr. to show up with Larry Flynt, I mean, first of all, he's a publisher of Hustler magazine. That's kind of bold. But the fact that he was associated with trying to investigate the death of his father, that speaks volumes to what he was really thinking behind the scenes. But my book explores all of it, from the lies about the weather that night. It wasn't hazy, and Kennedy was much more qualified to fly than we've been told, to the 9:39 p.m. phone call that was thrown down the memory hole.
That is key, because he informed the airport of his imminent approach.
Right, and they disappeared that. They threw it down the memory lane. And, the Coast Guard sent a officer, Petty Officer Todd Bergen, to be interviewed, and I have the I have the unedited footage. Somebody sent it to me at the time. A researcher in Texas, Scott Meyer, sent me the unedited footage, videotaped of the coverage that day, and that 9:39 p.m. phone call is talked about repeatedly. And there is an interview with Todd Bergen you can see on there where he talks about nothing but the phone call. Now, the Coast Guard is not going to send somebody to talk about a phone call that they claim didn't happen. So that's where we're at with that. And I think that there's no doubt about that he was 39 years old, Kennedy was, just really coming into the fact that I'm going to become a political animal. Good looking as any movie star, charismatic. He didn't have any baggage in his background, no scandals. And they realized this guy unquestionably would have been elected. He probably would have gotten 90% of the women vote. Just on his looks. And
what seat was he eyeing?
Well, I mean, there, some people think that he was going to run for the Senate from New York at the time. Hillary Clinton was another member of the Clinton body cloud. And, other people have accused Bush. I mean, but I think, again, the people at the top, whoever does this stuff, it's just kind of an inevitability about it. And,
well, if you kill the father.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to do what?
Exactly.
Kill
and
the son. Yeah.
Exactly. And what people don't, I talked a little bit in the book about this too, is that even Caroline Kennedy, the only surviving child of JFK, when she was considered a shoo-in to replace someone in the Senate, in New York, to replace Hillary Clinton in the Senate in New York a few years after that, they pulled the rug out from under at the last minute with this vicious campaign where they ran a headline in the paper saying Caroline Kennedy says 200 times or something. And I published in the book the New York Times official policy on, they routinely clean up the grammar of celebrated figures who aren't sometimes that articulate. They don't make them sound like blithering idiots. Well, they made Caroline Kennedy sound like a blithering idiot. And they did that on purpose, and she got the message and quickly dropped out. You'll never hear from her politically again. And I don't think, to me, she doesn't seem to have that kind of, curious bone in her body, unless maybe behind the scenes she's into this too. But she seems to have the attitude that most of them have is, oh, don't talk about it. You'll hurt me if you even talk about it. But they still felt so threatened by her because they, realized blood is thicker than water. This is John F. Kennedy's child. They couldn't chance having her in the Senate. And I think that's what Bobby Kennedy Jr. might run up against too, if he did it. And it's really sad, but I think this is the way. It's very important for them. The Kennedy assassination is kind of, as I call it, the mother of all conspiracies. It's, where the term conspiracy theorist first became popular, really was in talking about, we routinely use the term grassy knoll, to denigrate people. So it has such a cultural.
That was the CIA thing with their memo, right? Going out to.
Yeah, 1967, countering criticism of the Warren Report. Yeah. And if you read that memo, I mean, if that has not been followed to the letter by the media, I don't know what you could say. And they just coincidentally happened to, do everything the CIA suggested. But, and I think that's, whether when I talk about all those Kennedys, it's not like this is a war of the Kennedys against the establishment, but, they are one particular family, I believe, that really threatens the establishment simply because of the secrets that lie behind if they could expose the underbelly of any one of these huge events, whether it was the assassination of JFK or 9/11, something, these seminal events, it really would constitute a revolution in and of itself.
Yeah.
Because people realize the extent of, wow, what was done. I'm sorry, Ewan.
Oh, it's a good look at the Kennedy phenomenon. Is even Joe Kennedy, when he was ambassador to the United Kingdom, he was opposed to U.S. entry into the war. And if you go back and look at the deep state intrigues of the U.S. entry into that war, the interests that were ultimately behind both world wars, banking interests, Anglo-American banking interests, Zionism, these things. World War II isn't what we've been taught it was. It's not quite the good versus evil Manichaean struggle that we were told it was. It's much more complicated, far more interesting than you read in any textbook.
Yeah, the term good war, I think, is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
They try to portray that as a good war, and it's all wars are bad. And I think that's when Kennedy made his American University speech. It's like no speech any president ever gave before.
Yeah, that was June 1963.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and he again signed his death warrant with that. I mean, no president has ever talked about peace in those terms. I mean, instead, we have to get tough and, we have to do this. The American people have never backed down from a challenge. They were always ready to sacrifice, that kind of stuff. But, Kennedy was talking about seeing his enemies, seeing our alleged enemies in human terms. And these are human beings too,
He spoke of secret societies, didn't he?
Yes, and he talked about secret societies that, we find this repugnant in a free society. And these are things no president ever had talked about before. He really was a revolutionary figure in a lot of ways, even though he was also had a real pragmatic side to him. He was playing politics behind the scenes too, but enough of that got out in the public record where certainly I think the people that ran things must have been mortified. What do we have here? We have we really have a here.
I think it was Joe Kennedy's quote attributed to him as saying when his son won the West Virginia primary.
Yeah.
And he says, I paid for a victory, not a landslide. I'm willing to pay for victory, but not a landslide. I mean, that's politics.
Yeah, no, it is. And, I don't know the extent. I mean, Joe Kennedy, I think, has been, I tend to defend him a lot, too. There's a book out recently that it's got a lot of attention about Rosemary Kennedy, the hidden Kennedy daughter Joe Kennedy. I mean, here's a man. I mean, just to talk about Greek tragedy, even wouldn't go this far. Where you're talking about he had, 2 children die in separate plane crashes. His oldest daughter, Kathleen, died in a plane crash too. And he had Joe Kennedy Jr. is the apple of his eye.
Yeah.
Both died in separate plane crashes. He has to endure that. Then he has his other 2 sons die in separate murders.
Yeah.
These are 4 unnatural, unrelated deaths of your children. I mean, that's mind-boggling. And later, of course, he didn't. And actually, Ted Kennedy had a plane crash too. He survived it in 1962. But so, I mean, and then Rosemary, his daughter, who was a little slow in the terms that they would use, and they've been an absolutely gorgeous woman. And you look at this rich, high-profile family. Kennedy wanted to do something to help her, and he paid a lot of money for, at that time, what was considered a new groundbreaking procedure, frontal lobotomy. Yeah. And he whisked her off, and his idea was to have it done as a surprise for his wife and his family. And, it backfired, and she became like a 3-year-old or 4-year-old. Yeah. And, to act as if he did something wrong, but he was doing it out of love. He wanted to help her, and the doctors told him this is a potentially revolutionary thing. You'll cure her.
Yeah.
She'll be just as, bright and able as the rest of your children. So he must have felt horrible about that, but he still blamed as if this was something he did, like he wanted that to happen. And I think he's been a very unfairly maligned figure. I mean, you look at his children all loved and respected him. He was much closer to his children than the mother Rosemary was. It was kind of a cold and distant figure, but he was, by all accounts, I think, a great father, and I'm sure he had his corrupt elements to it. But when I look at his background compared to the Rockefellers or Morgans, really,
he's nothing. I mean,
they were the
he's a piker.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was the cleanest, guy that accumulated that kind of a fortune that I could find, and I think that. Maybe the others knew that, and I think they resented the fact that he was maybe the first real Catholic kind of outside that WASP establishment that made that kind of money.
Yeah, and also I don't think he was part of this weird occultic, some of the weird that you see with the Rockefellers,
No, I don't think you're ever going to see a Kennedy at Bohemian Grove.
Yeah.
Or I don't think they're ever going to be there. And I think that was, they weren't Masons, obviously, because they're Catholics, and so they were outside a lot of these organizations, and even though they had a lot of money, they were not considered old money, whatever.
No. They were still shantyboat Irish from that perspective.
Exactly. So I think they were considered outsiders, and they knew, no matter how much JFK played the establishment liberal game when he was running for president, they knew who his father was, and they knew how influential his father was over him, and that's why Harry Truman was against his candidacy. Adlai Stevenson didn't like him at first. He grew to like him. Eleanor Roosevelt didn't like him. The left at the time, and this is, again, unheard of. You don't see this even now. I mean, you might see that if Donald Trump gets nominated on the Republican side. You're probably going to have the entire Republican establishment against him, but at that time, it was really unprecedented. They usually rally around whoever the nominee is. I mean, Reagan, when he ran, a lot of the Republican establishment didn't like him at first either, but once he was nominated, they stepped in line, and they got behind him. And then eventually they tried to mainstream it. In JFK's case, Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Truman, these old leftists, they weren't about to, because they remembered his father and they didn't trust him, and he wasn't part of their club.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. He was, he was kind of like just the outsider, kind of like Tom Cruise in Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah, exactly.
Just never, or what's not? Remember maybe Barry Lyndon, if you're familiar with that movie.
Yeah.
They can never quite get in.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I think it is.
But again, they weren't. Kennedys aren't so much cursed as they are targeted, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I mean, just you look at the list of their deaths. I mean, it's just. Sure, some of that could be due to. But I mean, these are not people that are raised in a trailer park or a ghetto where violent death may be a lot more likely.
It is strange. Yes.
These are very, very wealthy people. They shouldn't be prone to die constantly in plane crashes, or Michael Kennedy dying while skiing, running into a tree. I mean, these are just bizarre ways that they David Kennedy, the drug overdose when he was very young, and so Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s ex-wife, found hung in a barn a few years ago. I mean, how many people do you know like that? I mean, if you heard about one of these deaths in your life, it's like, what?
Another thing is, from what I understand, is hanging is a very odd death for women. I mean, it's choice of suicide.
Yeah, yes.
Same thing with the D.C. Madam, right?
Deborah Jane Palfrey. She goes on Alex Jones and assures the audience, I'm not going to kill myself. And then she does, and that's what happens,
Yeah.
And we saw it with her, and actually one of her clients, Bambi something, I believe, was killed first, and then she was found hung after she said she wouldn't do it, and that's the kind of power we have that we're facing. But we have to talk about it, because it's not going to get any better until we do. And I think the good thing is that I think more and more young people are waking up to this. And I find when I'm talking to people, that young people are the most receptive to it, because they understand like what we've constructed and how awful the economy really is, despite the lies, and they know that JFK certainly represented a brighter time, more optimistic time when it looked as if America could do anything. And now it doesn't seem like they can do anything.
Yeah.
It's gone.